Hello and welcome to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. This podcast is all about our journey into the woods of ourselves, getting to know who we are, and where we're going in life, so that we can create the life that we want to live. It's about deepening your connection with yourself, taking inspired action, and really trusting yourself and your intuition. It's also about mindset. Our beliefs are such an important part of this journey, and there are so many ways for us to change our mindset so that we can more easily live a life of expansive joy. This podcast is also about going literally into the woods and spending time in nature, and how that can help us on our own personal journey of self-knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now let's get into this week's episode. Hello and welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, episode 370. This is your host, Holly Wharton, and I'm back with another exciting guest. This week, I am speaking with Brad Borkan, author of the book When Your Life Depends on It, Extreme Decision-Making Lessons from the Antarctic. Now, Brad and I know each other in the real world. We first met up at a Meetup group for authors in London, and I really enjoyed his book. I loved reading the stories of Antarctic explorers, but even more than that, I loved how he brought it back to practical, real-life lessons. I'd read stories about Shackleton before and his trips to the Antarctic, and they were really entertaining, but this book really brings it back to how you can use their experience to make better decisions in your life, based on how they made life or death decisions 100 plus years ago. So I know that most of us are probably not going to make it to the South Pole, but we do all have our own adventures in life. Many of us have our own outdoors adventures. And this episode will help you learn how to make better decisions in life, which I think is a super important skill. So let's learn a little bit more about Brad. Brad Borkan has a lifelong interest in how people survive and thrive in almost impossible situations. Brad is the co-author of the book When Your Life Depends on It. That book also puts the reader right into the action of life and death decisions made by early explorers. Also looks at what we can learn from their situations to help us make better decisions in our modern lives. Brad is an author and lecturer and has presented at business and Antarctic conferences. He's appeared on cable TV in the US, he's been a guest on podcasts and internet radio programs, as well as been a keynote speaker at a literary festival. He's also traveled to all 7 continents. In 2019, Brad gave a guest lecture about his book on a 114-passenger expedition cruise to Antarctica. And by the way, When Your Life Depends on It has been endorsed by Sir Ranulph Fiennes, the world's greatest living explorer, which is super exciting. Brad is originally from the US and is now based in London. He was also honored to be made a Fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. He and his co-author are now working on a new book about decision-making to be released at the end of this year. His website is extreme-decisions.com. So without further ado, let's jump into this episode. Here's what you're going to learn: how people make decisions, both the good and bad ones, how we can learn to make better decisions in life, things we can learn from Antarctic explorers, why it's so life-changing to recognize the teams we have in our lives. We have a lot of teams that we may not recognize as teams. So we have a really interesting conversation about this. Finally, we talk about how we can use our own outdoor adventures to make better decisions in life. So we are here today with Brad Borkan talking about how outdoors adventures can help you to make better decisions in life. Hello, Brad.
Hi, Holly. It's great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you because I just finished reading Brad's book, which is called When Your Life Depends on It, Extreme Decision-Making Lessons from the Antarctic. And I really enjoyed the book. So thank you for writing that.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. And there's just fabulous stories from the Antarctic from the early 1900s. So.
They are. That is such extreme decisions, and every decision that you make could lead to life or death. So how did you become interested in Antarctic exploration? Where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, it sort of started from childhood and this interest in why do people make the decisions they do? Why do people do things that are extreme and dangerous? Because in myself, I'm not someone who lives at the edge. I'm not someone who is going to go climb tall mountains and do dangerous things like jumping out of airplanes and skydiving, things like that. So these people, when I found out about them, started reading books about early Antarctic explorers when I was about 8 years old. I just was captivated by the stories.
Mm.
And as you said at the beginning, there are stories about life and survival and trying to do things that were out of the ordinary and putting themselves in danger for the purpose of science and discovery and exploration. Just a thrilling topic. And I guess the reason it gravitated towards me so much was these people came near death all the time, but very rarely ever died.
Yeah, that's shocking to me. I'd read about Shackleton before, but I hadn't heard about all the other stories that you include in the book. And it's just shocking that so many of them came back alive.
It is. It's really quite breathtaking when you think about the sorts of dangers they put themselves in time and time and time again. And it's not just the physical challenge of Antarctica, whereas you have extremes of cold and wind and blizzards and things like that, but they're coping with scurvy and frostbite and snow blindness and also the risk of falling in a crevasse.
Yeah.
They're just amazing people, but they're amazing situations.
So for anyone who's new to this topic, can you refresh us on when did all of this happen? When was the peak in Antarctic exploration? Because it's shocking to me that people were doing this so long ago in such terrible gear.
I know. It's actually, when you think about Antarctica, if you go back to like the 1820s, which is actually in the realm of history, and you think of the United States, I mean, the United States was formed in 1776 as a nation, and yet we think about that as being a long time ago. But it wasn't that long in terms of civilization. And yet you look at Antarctica, but in the 1820s, we knew more about the moon, the cycles of the moon, how the distance from the Earth, the cycles of the eclipses and things like that. We know because Antarctica existed.
Wow.
And the first person set foot on it in 1895. And the time period we're talking about is 1901 to 1917. So it's just after Antarctica, someone's really put foot on Antarctica, and people trying to get to the South Pole is really the heart of the stories.
So this was just over 100 years ago, and things have changed. The world has changed so much since then, and outdoors gear has changed so much since then. So can you give us an idea of what kinds of conditions these people were going into and what kinds of gear they had to really survive the conditions?
Yeah, it's a fascinating period of time because the world was becoming very technologically advanced. I know when compared to modern age, it seems very primitive, but for their time, cars were just being invented, airplanes just being invented. You had communications technologies becoming prevalent, electricity, all sorts of different things were being developed. And yet at the same time, they go down to Antarctica, they don't have any of this. And so there's no communication. As we say in the book, there's no communication except as far as you can shout.
Oh, yeah.
So they get into trouble. They're on their own. They can't even call to their colleagues, even if they're like half a mile away. I mean, it's just literally, they are isolated. They have to bring down all their own food. There are animals, seals and penguins that live on the coastline. But once you move into the interior, even a few miles, you're away from all that. And so if you're trying to go into the center of Antarctica to get to the South Pole, which is about 850 miles from the coastline, you have to bring everything. And that includes fuel for cooking and melting snow for water. So people don't think about the idea that, oh, I've got all this snow around me, at least I have water. And as you probably know from hiking, that you put snow in your mouth, that's fine, you get a little bit of water from it. But do that often enough, you'll lower your core body temperature.
Yeah.
And it can actually be fatal. So and plus you had this challenge around the food they were carrying. They didn't know anything about vitamins, calories. As one person described it to me once, they said doing the work, what they're doing is called man-hauling, which is pulling the sledge. So some teams use dogs, some teams use ponies. The ponies didn't work very well.
Yeah.
For the most part, it was man-hauling, which is basically strapping on these harnesses and pulling your sledge, which is made out of wood with metal runners, and pulling it across the snow and ice. And actually, they found the metal didn't work very well. So really just the wood runners, and it's carrying everything, your tent, your sleeping bag. You didn't have thin slate, didn't have down, and no plastic. So it's all wooden crates for the food. And it was hard going. And then you had to melt the snow for your water. It's just daunting why they did all this.
Yeah, and these were really long journeys. So as you said, it was 850 miles from the coast to the South Pole, roughly. How long of a journey was that?
So you're talking roughly traveling about anywhere from 5 to 12 miles a day. Maybe on a good day, 17 miles, 18 or 20 miles a day. Depends on the surface. And also you get caught up in a blizzard. You could be stuck in your tent for 3 or 4 days where you're not traveling at all. So you're talking, could be 100 days on the ice. It could be further. It could be much more than that. And so it's a lot. It's 3 months on the ice, and it's a lot that you've got to carry all your. Now, what they were doing was they were laying depots along the way and picking them up on the way back. So, but even still, there were many hardships. But from the point of view of all this, what's interesting is, well, it's wonderful history. There's a lot we can learn from what they did for modern life, and I think that's when you get into the grips of the book, and what we're trying to do with it is these stories are not just, wow, that's cool history, that's really fascinating what these guys did, but it's more like, what can I take away from my modern life? What can your listeners take away for how do you deal in this COVID era? How do you deal with challenges this modern life? Work, juggling work and achievement and goals and finances and all this other stuff. And there's always tons and tons of lessons about that come out of these expeditions.
So at what point did you realize that you had enough lessons from these Antarctic stories to write a book about it?
Well, it's interesting. I maybe about 8 or 10 years ago, I decided I'd pursue my interest in this. I always had an interest in decision making and had this background interest in what happened in Antarctica. And about 8 or 10 years ago, I started attending Antarctic conferences and listening to people talk about the history and all this stuff and thinking, well, these great stories, these great expeditions, all the achievements, all the hardships. And at the same time, what I realized was no one had ever looked at the expeditions from the point of view of decisions. The common thread through all these expeditions was the decision making. But people looked at men were wearing or what they were trying to accomplish or other elements about their biographies, who these people were. But to me, the most exciting thing was the life and death decisions. How did they actually make these decisions? How did they deal with the aftermath when they made a bad decision? You put a bunch of men together, and they're all men at that time, into a small environment, because if they're living in the hut or in a tent, it's a very small, cramped environment, in very adverse conditions, colds, lack of food, things like that, not knowing if they're going to survive. And yet you come out of this period of these 6 expeditions, and there are no history of fistfights. People didn't murder each other or sabotage the expedition. It's like, why did that happen when every other expedition, it was different? You go look at the expeditions to the Arctic, you look at even other expeditions to the Antarctic. But these expeditions, what was different? And I think that's what's so eye-opening about this, is that somehow there was a difference. And what we're trying to do is articulate that difference.
So tell us a little bit more about your book. How is it structured? What kinds of things do you talk about in it?
Okay, we were very interested in the decision making. So we didn't approach the book chronologically, which is sort of the logical way you look at these expeditions. Let's start in 1901 and start with Captain Scott and move on to Shackleton and Captain Scott goes back down again. And you're like, okay, well, that's all interesting history. But what's really interesting is let's focus on decision making. What was the chapters deal with types of decisions, about promises being made, about what happens when you fall into a crevasse. Where do you seek inspiration? There's a wonderful story. It's like the 3rd chapter, and Mawson happens to be on his own. He's on his own because he was traveling with 2 other men, and you've got to figure out ways to travel that make sense. I mean, much like you do with your hiking, your backpacking, that you've got to figure out strategies that are going to ensure your survival. So they had 2 sledges, and they called them sledges, using the British term. They put all their gear, and what they said, well, we'll put all the important gear, most of the food, everything on this, considered to be the 2nd sledge. And the person pulling the 1st sledge, and they had dogs. This team had dogs. And so we'll do with that is we'll be the lead sledge, and the other sledge will follow, the man leading that one will follow behind. And so because you don't want to fall in a crevasse, and crevasses can be hidden by what are called snow lids. Level sets, basically ice and snow that looks solid ground and it isn't. And you step on it and the thing collapses underneath you when you fall in the crevasse. So they said, we'll put all the important stuff behind us and then we're going forward. And if we fall in the crevasse, at least everything behind us won't fall in. And lo and behold, they discover a snow lid and they turn around to warn the other guy and he's not there. And nor is his sledge, and nor is the dogs. And he's fallen into a different crevasse.
Oh, God.
And totally disappeared. And they run over to the area, and he's gone. He's like the crevasse is deep. They know he's not going to survive. there's no way to pull them out. It's it. And so they're on their own. And then Mawson and this other fellow travel trying to get back to camp. Again, no communication except as far as they can shout. There's no one going to come rescue them. And it gets down to the other guy dies. They're slowly eating the dogs, killing the dogs and eating them because that's their only food source because all the other food was on the other sledge. And basically the liver of dogs has a lot of vitamin A, and vitamin A is poisonous to humans. They're both sort of slowly dying. The first, I think, guy dies first, and Mawson's on his own, and at the very ends up falling in a crevasse on his own. The only reason he can pull himself out is because his sledge gets stuck at the top in some ice, and he is dangling from the harness of this. He's attached to the sled through this harness, and basically has to climb up about 14 feet. And it's where does he get that inspiration? And it's just such an amazing story. It's this guy who climbs. Again, you're wearing all this old clothing covered in ice and snow, and heavy sets, 2 or 3 sets of gloves and heavy hiking boots, and pulls himself up, and then the top of the crevasse breaks away, and he can't pull himself up, and he falls back down. The sledge, fortunately, doesn't come back down on top of him, and he's stuck down. And he's like, what am I going to do now? I might as well just give up. And it's sort of at that point, he gets inspired by a poem. And these guys found inspiration in very different sorts of ways, in various things they'd read or songs, or this happened to be a poem that was just about living is hard, but dying is easy. And he thinks about this and says, well, I'm just going to give it another try. But it's just a remarkable story. He does eventually, the thing about this is he survives this, gets himself all the way back to base camp where there are a few men waiting for him. But they're waiting for him because the ship, which can't stay for long in the bay because it'll ice over and the ship will get stuck in the ice, has already sailed away. And it sailed away 5 hours before he got back. And he has to overwinter for another half year before he can be rescued. It's just like, these stories are just, they're mind-boggling about survival. And
I think the will to live is just so much stronger than we ever realize until we're in one of those situations. Because I've seen documentaries about like the 2 guys that were mountain climbing, and the one guy cut off the other guy and he fell down, and then he had to like crawl back to camp. I remember watching that and thinking, I don't know if I could do that. Like, I don't know if I would be the one like crawling back to camp on my broken legs, or would I just curl up and die of overexposure? But I think when you're in that situation, something kicks in.
I think that's right. And I think one of the great lessons from the early explorers is you are where you are. And it's such a great lesson for the era in which we live right now. For them, it was like you just put one in front of the other and you start moving forward, and you don't dwell on how you got here. Mawson, being in the crevasse, thinking like, what am I going to do next? Can't sit there and go worry about, how did I get here? And, we just had a whole ton of bad luck. And it's like, we are where we are. Just got now we need to pull ourselves out or put one step in front of the other. And that simple task of being like, I'm just going to keep going. And you talk about this in your South Downs book, in your walk, when you're like, do I keep going or do I give up? It's like, it's like, these are hard choices. And yet you've got to say, okay, this is where I am. It's like, I didn't bring enough water today. I'm going to, I'm going to suffer, but I'm going to keep going. And it's persevering.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think persevering is a lot easier when you have a really clear goal. So like when you're trying to get to the South Pole and be the first guy to get to the South Pole, or when you want to walk a trail. But in day-to-day life, I think a lot of people either don't have clear goals, or they haven't made conscious decisions in life, and they've just kind of found themselves in situations where they're like, how did I get here, and what do I do about this?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think one of the reasons that we think the expeditions did so well was they had very clear goals. And everyone on the expedition knew the goal, or knew the set of goals. And I think this is important in one's personal life, is saying, I've got this goal. And if I can relate a personal story, but it relates also to the Antarctic book, is there's a story of Shackleton, and he's trying to get to the South Pole. He set up an expedition. It took 2 years to set up the expedition. He and 3 others are walking to the South Pole, and they get to within 103 miles of the pole. And they are running out of food. And they've depoted food along for the way back, but they haven't depoted enough food. And they know that. And they're saying, we've gone out like 700 something miles. We're 103 miles from our goal. We could persevere through, but we may not survive we're almost guaranteed not to have enough food to get back. And no one's going to come rescue us. This is just the way it's going to be. So do we be heroes and go out and get to the South Pole, probably die on the way back, or do we turn around? And we look at life, and I think this is where we look at life and we look at our goals and say, we've got this goal, and getting that goal is going to be hard, and we're going to persevere. Or we say, hey, I'm going to stop. I'm going to decide today's not my day for that goal. I'm going to go choose a different goal. And this comes back to my book, but I just wanted to finish that story, which is that Shackleton looks at that situation, and where you think it's just a binary decision. It's either we go forward and we get to the South Pole, but we'll probably die on the way back, or we turn around at this very point at 103 miles from the South Pole. And he's like, no, there's a third choice. The third choice is we leave our sleeping bag and our tent and everything behind, and we just walk forward as far south as we can for one day. We plant a flag and we turn around and go back. And you're like, why? Why would you do this? And it's because he wanted to cross the 100-mile mark. He wants to say, when he got back to Britain, we got to within 100 miles of the South Pole. Sounds a whole lot better than we got to 103 miles of the South Pole.
Yeah.
They got to within 97 miles of the South Pole. They planted a British flag, and they walked back to their camp. The next day, packed it up, and started heading the long journey back. And that ability to say, I'm not going to achieve my goal, I'm going to plant a flag, I'm going to do something different. And that's exactly what I did in terms of writing the book. I'm working for a large software company. I've got a goal of achieving a certain level in the company. I just knew I was going to get there. It wasn't in my DNA. It just wasn't not going to happen. And I thought, what do I learn? I've been thinking about Antarctic expeditions and things like that. What could I learn from all this? And I thought, well, I'll plant my flag and say, that's as far as I'm going to get in a software company. That's it. That's my career. It's done. But what can I do different? Plant my flag and go do something different. I thought, I want to go write this Antarctic book. It's like, let's talk. I've always wanted to write about this decision-making thing and the Antarctic thing. And that was the start of my author career. That's how I met you. It's like the ability to say, I've got to plant my flag. And I think in this era which we live in right now, where everyone's plans have been disrupted, our financial plans, our career plans, our plans for how we're raising our kids, everything has been disrupted. You got to say, okay, now I'm going to plant my flag at maybe multiple different flags. I'm going to now we're going to have a new goal, a new aspiration. And I think there are a lot of lessons that come from these expeditions that are very relevant to today.
And so how do you think people can learn to find that third choice? Because I think it's so easy to see life as being binary. It's black and white. It's this or it's that. How can people open up their perspective to find the third, fourth, or other options?
That's a really, really challenging question.
I know.
It comes down to trying to rethink, to break patterns. We're taught a lot of times every decision is yes or no. Every decision is forward or back. Every decision is go, no go. And often it's something different than that. Just trying to be like, let's try something a little bit different. What if I took this approach? What if I looked at it from this other perspective? What if I look at it from the perspective of not me in this situation, but someone looking at me in this situation? What would they say? And in fact, there's a very, very funny story that comes out of this, which is, so Shackleton makes this decision to not go to the South Pole, to get past the 100-mile mark. And on their journey back, he writes to his wife. He said, I thought you would rather have a live donkey than a dead lion. It's like you'd rather live to see another day, and you can't always be the hero, and just look at different ways. Okay, I'm not going to be the hero. I'm going to try to just achieve something different. Yeah. But you must have the same situations in your walks and in your author life. And
certainly never a life and death situation. But and I think it's so challenging to get out of that this or that perspective and kind of step back and find the other options. So as you brought up, the first time I walked the South Downs Way, I got to that day where we had record heat here in the UK. I think that was the day we got to like 39 degrees. I'd been walking in 35 plus weather all week. It was really difficult for me. I mean, this week we've been having that kind of weather and I've just been sitting in my office and roasting. I can't believe I walked as much as I did that week. But I got to the day where I realized I was going to run out of water. I was trying to kind of pace myself with my water, but I just realized I didn't have enough. And so it was like, well, what do I do? Got to the point where if I turned back, I'd be walking the same amount that I needed to walk to get to my destination. So that didn't make sense. But I was at a point where I could take a 2-mile detour from the trail and buy some water. So I did. And that made my journey longer that day, but water is important. And so that's the decision that I made.
And that's really critical. I think the thing about decision making, and one of the other things that comes out of the Antarctic explorers that we emphasize in the book, is what's most important is making a decision. You come to a decision point, you make a decision. Mm-hmm. Procrastinating isn't good, and overthinking it isn't good.
Yes.
And with Google, we're so easy nowadays to overthink decisions. I can search for the perfect house. I can search for the perfect car. I can search for the perfect relationship. I can search for everything I can find. I'm like, I'll obsess about, if I want to buy a new phone, which is the best phone, if I want to buy anything electronic for the house, anything that is like, you can analyze to the nth degree. Mm-hmm. But what the explorers were very good at was saying, we came to a decision point, we're going to make a decision. And we know we're resilient enough and resourceful enough that if we made a bad decision, we can correct it. You don't know how you're going to correct it, but you do know you can correct it. There's nothing that can be thrown at you that you couldn't figure out a way through. Hmm. I mean, in Antarctica, you still could fall in a crevasse and die, or die of scurvy, or die from a blizzard, or die for all sorts of multitude of different things. And at the same time, it's like you're just going to, at one level, the other side of that coin is you're going to persevere. Mm. You're going to persevere until it finally catches up with you. Mm. And I think it's that combination of just making decisions, making them quickly, knowing you're not going to make always the best decision. You're not going to make perfect decisions. Are you going to make the decision? And your water decision on your trail is like, do I go forward, do I back? I've got to decide, I'm going to make a detour. It's a decision, and you've got to make it. And the more you procrastinate, the more dehydrated you can become.
Yeah. Yeah, I just did this advanced bushcraft course last week, and one of the things that we talked about, we spent a long time talking about hypothermia, hyperthermia, hydration, all of that. And one of the things they said was, what do you do with water? Do you ration it or do you not? And most people said ration, and they were like, no, you drink it, because you can probably find a water source later down the line if you need to. But the more dehydrated you are, the less likely you are to make good decisions. One of the first thing that goes is proper decision making. So stay hydrated, drink your water, and then just look out for new water. Figure out how you're going to get more water, but stay hydrated.
That's a critical point. It's the ability to think that sometimes what seems like the rational decision is not the best decision. Mm-hmm. And the rational thing would be ration the water, ration the food. It's like, but at the same time, once you start impairing your decision-making ability, you're really compromised.
Yeah.
In Antarctica, where it can be really cold, the cold impairs your decision-making ability. And some studies were done saying it's like your brain power diminishes by 30%. Certainly at the top of Everest, people have talked about how they become very sluggish. Their brain becomes very sluggish in the high altitude and the cold. So you've got to make good decisions as you go and consume food, consume water.
Yeah, I was really struck by that guy who ended up on his own going back to base camp, and he had, I think, 3 biscuits and a small piece of chocolate for 3 days of hiking.
That was an absolutely remarkable story. That story is worth retelling for a little bit, because it's the way we start the book out. And the book starts out, the very first, it's not even a chapter, it's a little prologue of these 3 guys on the ice. One of them is dying of scurvy. They've gone out 750 miles, they're on the way back. It's not Shackleton. It's not any of the people you would know from the famous, it's not Mawson or Captain Scott or any of the famous people. And yet it's 3 guys, they went out 750 miles, they're on the way back. We don't tell you where they went, what they're doing, why they're there. It's just that one of them is dying of scurvy, and the other 2 have to decide are they going to stay with him or are they going to leave him behind. And he tells them, I know I'm dying, just leave me behind. And they hesitate to make a decision, and he turns to them and says, I'm your commanding officer, which he was. Of those 3 men, he was indeed their commanding officer. And he says, I'm giving you a military decision, and to disobey is mutiny. So now what do you do?
Yeah.
They made this, in that case, they made a decision very quickly. And the long and short story of all that was ultimately they stayed with him. They kept going. They put him on the sledge. They were pulling him along with all their supplies. 2 men pulling the sledge, pulling with their supplies. They were almost out of food. And he was very, very near death all the time. And there'd be mornings they'd wake up and be like, they were sure he was dead. And they'd so revive him with a little bit of brandy or something. And they were keep going. And eventually they got to a point where he could not go any further. And one man had to make this absolutely remarkable journey of with only a couple biscuits and some sticks of chocolate in his pocket, and walk like 35 miles in the snow. It's like on his own, and live and do or die with no water. Again, no mechanism for heating water, heating snow to make water. I mean, it was literally do or die. It was just unbelievable.
These stories are remarkable. So what else can we learn from these Antarctic explorers from 100 plus years ago that's applicable to our modern day lives?
I think one of the key things is about teams, and we think about teams as being teams at work. And I still work for the same big software company. It's we constantly do things in teams, and everything that was done in Antarctica was done in teams. But we actually, in our personal lives, we are in teams as well. And our teams are not just family units. They're teams of people. I mean, Holly, you and I are in amongst a group of authors that meet once a month and chat about our writing and the challenges of being an author and juggling our lives and advertising our books and how to write better and achieve better results with our writing. And we're part of a team.
Yep.
And that team used to meet in Piccadilly Circus at Waterston's at Piccadilly Circus every month, and now we meet by Zoom.
Yeah.
But that we're parts of lots of other interesting teams. I'm teams with my co-author, our editor, the book designer, so many different people that help create this book and our next book. Teams with other friends of mine who are in America, friends in UK. And I think this is important to see ourselves as team members. And it doesn't mean, even if you're not working in a corporation, to think of yourself as team members. And it gives you that camaraderie, it gives you that sense of purpose. You can be a team leader. You can be on some teams, you may be a leader. On other teams, you may be a follower. And I think that was important for the Antarctic explorers. But it's important in our modern lives where we're very isolated from other people right now because of the pandemic, and that sense that we can build more teams.
And I think that's one of the reasons why people are struggling so much with lockdown and quarantine, because they're used to being a part of teams, even if they didn't recognize them as such. And now they're feeling very alone because they're living much more solitary lives and their teams are not as clearly defined.
Exactly. But you can create those teams. But think just that changing your mindset and changing your language to be, hey, I'm part of teams. I'm like, it's like we have a bunch of friends from high school that I grew up with, and we've been close ever since. And we meet up on Zoom every now and then. We trade emails. We send joke cartoons around different things or articles that are interesting. And just feeling part of that team has been meaningful to me. And I think for everyone searching for that meaning right now is thinking, how do I build more of these teams? I've reached out to more people I haven't connected to in a long time. Guy who was my roommate when I was in university. It's like these sorts of connections. Now I have a bit more time in my home and not commuting. It's like, and I've heard from so many people have reconnected with people they knew. In a sense, it's sort of team building. I mean, you may not think of it as team building, but rekindling those friendships is great.
It is. And it's now that you're saying this, I'm aware of so many other areas of my life in which I've been doing this as well. I mean, I quit doing interviews and having guests on the podcast for about a year. And it was during lockdown that I started having guests on the show again, because I just felt that need to connect with people on the show in a way that I hadn't for about a year and a half. So yeah, it's very interesting the way we're reaching out to people in new ways or rekindling old ways of connecting.
It is. And I think it changes. Life has changed a lot in the last 6 months. And our ability to embrace that change and come away from it thinking, actually, some things are worse by a long shot, but some things are a little bit better in an interesting way. And I think this connection is interesting. So, I mean, even in the Antarctic community, where just like with the author group, we meet once a month. There would be Antarctic meetings in London where you'd get like-minded people together for talks, and that would happen at the RGS. There are talks every Monday evening. There are Antarctic groups that meet once every 6 months for dinner at Dulwich College, which Dulwich College is a high school that Shackleton went to.
Ah.
And that and there'll be a talk and a dinner for that. And that can't happen now. But the thing is, these sort of things start moving to Zoom, and all of a sudden you end up with an audience that was primarily a London-based or UK-based audience. Now you've got an international audience attending. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you've got a whole different dynamic. Or something an event that could be attended by 50 people now could be attended by 1,000 people. And you just get a very different dynamic. And that's quite exciting and invigorating.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So one of the things that you mentioned that you're really fascinated about is how people make decisions. So how do people make decisions, and how can we learn to make better decisions?
This is an interesting and challenging area, because we actually make decisions all the time. I mean, we make small decisions and big decisions. I mean, whether it's, what email am I going to look at next is a decision versus what car am I going to buy next. And so you've got these big decisions and these smaller decisions. And I think it's weighing up opportunities. It's making decisions quickly is obviously a key to it. It's looking at when you made a bad decision, not beating yourself up for it, but learning from it.
Yes.
And being, okay, what did I do? How did I lead to that decision? And why did I make it? And being like, okay, so that was an interesting decision, but what can I do better next time from that? But it's not easy. I mean, I'm hardly a great decision maker myself, and I've read about it. And I think I've met other authors who write about decision making. They're the same. No one's a perfect decision maker.
No, of course not.
And you can look at people like any of the successful entrepreneurs, and they're not perfect decision makers. If they're honest in their biographies and autobiographies, and some are and some aren't, but the ones who are really honest will tell you all of the failures, all of the challenges, all the mistakes they've made all along the way. And
yeah, and I find that a lot of people, when they read my books, that's one of the things that they compliment me on is sharing kind of the inner journey and how difficult it is for me, even when, I'm just walking a 100-mile trail and not going to the South Pole.
Well, I loved your stories because, I mean, I've read tons of books about Everest and mountain climbing. And because my original idea was this book was going to be both mountain climbing and Antarctica. And my co-authors were like, no, let's focus just on Antarctica. And we may one day do a book on mountain climbing. But I've read lots and lots of adventure stories from the Arctic, from the Antarctic, different places. And your story of a 100-mile walk in the South Downs is as thrilling and exciting as any of those.
Thank you.
And it's because you reveal so much of yourself in that, and the self-doubt and the questioning, why am I doing this, and what am I getting out of this, and how do I deal with the challenges of this? If you're not, it's one thing when you read about a guy who's been training for 3 years, who's in the peak physical condition and has climbed 15 different mountains, and now they're going to go tackle Everest. It's like, that's a different sort of person than the person who's going to tackle going from being a day walker to being a South Downs 7 to 10 day walking journey, staying in bed and breakfast. But it's still a journey, and it's still a challenge. And I think one of the things is the more we put ourselves out of our comfort zone, is that ability to get your decision making to be better. But there's no easy answer to how to make better decisions other than try not to beat yourself up when you make a bad one.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's decision paralysis. It's just don't tie yourself and be like, okay, I made a bad decision. I bought a bad car, a used car when I was quite a lot younger. and I was living in America, I bought a used car, and I bought it at dusk. And one of the dumbest things that you could possibly do is buy a car without really examining it in the daylight, and actually pretty rusted out. And my girlfriend at the time said, just stop obsessing about it. It's just nickname your car Rusty. And the car lasted for 3 years. I sold it on to somebody else, a friend of mine actually, and it lasted for them for another 3 years.
Wow.
And it was always rusty. But you can make a joke, out of it. Find us the sense of humor from having made a bad decision.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. I think a lot of people beat themselves up over making bad decisions and then get stuck in that, in like a loop of kind of self-hatred without learning from the situation. I remember this one time getting into this discussion with someone online. It was this online forum where she had explained this bad day that she had, where she literally just made a series of really bad decisions. Like, there were so many points where she could have gotten things on track, but she just kept making bad decisions. And so, I said to her, like stop feeling bad about it. Just learn from it. What can you learn from it? At this point, you could have done this or you could have done that. That would have turned things around. At this next point, you could have done this or you could have done that. And she was like, she couldn't see it. And this other woman kind of popped into the conversation. She was like, stop trying to make her feel bad. And I was like, on the contrary, I'm not trying to make her feel bad. I'm trying to make her feel better, because you can make better decisions next time. And they couldn't get it. And I was so confused. Like, how could someone possibly think I was trying to make her feel bad? And it wasn't until later that I learned the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. Some people believe they can learn from their mistakes and make their life better. And some people just believe they're stuck. They are what they are and they can't improve. And that is just heartbreaking to me that some people have that mindset.
Exactly. And I think the trick, I think, is sometimes looking for that third option.
Yeah.
It's looking for saying, maybe it wasn't such a bad decision after all. I mean, only the car decision. Yeah. Didn't turn out to be such a bad decision. Actually, it was a nice car. It just happened to have, it wasn't rust-proof properly, and the doors were rusting. But the engine function was fine, and the car was fine. But it's looking at decisions and thinking, I'll use that as a learning experience, and I'll move forward and just try to do better next time. But you won't do better next time. The reality is you can't do better next time. It's like people trying to second guess the stock market.
Yeah.
You can't guess the stock market. You can't be like, oh, I should have bought Apple stock, 15 years ago. Oh, for those people who bought Apple stock 10 years ago and sold it after they held it for a year, can beat themselves up and go, oh, I should have held it for longer. It's like, those are just decisions. They're just, you can't dwell on them. You should just again, it goes back to the explorers. Put one foot in front of the next. You're going to come to more decision points and make more decisions and hopefully better decisions as you. But you'll never make perfect decisions.
No.
I think getting out of this mindset that you can make perfect decisions. And you never know the outcome of a decision. I think this is one of the great lessons again that came out of the explorers was. They were doing scientific analysis in Antarctica 100 years ago and had no idea of the implications of that analysis they were doing. But that serves today as the baseline for climate change research. In fact, what we're doing today with some of their research is we're taking some of their samples that are in the Natural History Museum in London, and we're using modern scientific method to analyze and modern scientific apparatus to analyze samples that they took back 100 years ago.
Wow.
And they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, they didn't know they were doing these scientific samples, but had no idea the ramifications of the importance of having a baseline for climate change. And people are constantly going back to their data and being like, oh, so what did Shackleton and Scott discover, and what were conditions like, wind conditions, current conditions, the zoology, the meteorology of that region at that time.
So most of us are not going to make it to the South Pole. But how can we use our own outdoor adventures, however big or small, to learn how to make better decisions in life?
I think it's being very aware. And I got this from your books. I mean, I've now read two of your books. The book about trees. I mean, I'm just in the process of reading the book about trees. I've read the South Downs book, I've listened to a number of your podcasts. I mean, being outside and connecting with nature becomes critical. And whether that nature is a bunch of snow and ice and glaciers and mountains and not a lot else, or whether it's the beautiful woods of Surrey and the habitats of the hills and valleys and streams of England. I mean, it's connecting with nature and feeling part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And being aware of the decisions that we make. I mean, as you said, no matter how big or small your adventure, like you've always got decisions to make. Do I go this way? Do I go that way? Do I do this trail? Do I do that trail? What do I take with me? What kind of food? How much water? Like there's so many decisions in a modern day outdoor adventure, whether it's a day hike or a weekend backpacking trip, that our decisions will affect us.
Yes. Well, when I was going to Antarctica, I was like absolutely petrified. And I was probably doing it the tamest way one could possibly do it. I was going on a expedition cruise ship. I mean, it was like I gotta get myself down to Argentina and get myself onto this ship but I was going to be fed. I was not going to be climbing mountains and pulling my own supplies or doing anything like that. But I was absolutely petrified. Would I be cold? Would I be seasick? Would I be, do I have the right gear? There's so many decisions in the process, but a lot of this just takes research and talking with people, and I made some good decisions and some bad decisions, but it's quite thrilling to be there.
So tell us a little bit more about your trip, because that was late last year, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I spent almost all of November in Antarctica. We went from the south of South America to the Falkland Islands and then to South Georgia, which is an island very famous because that's where Shackleton was based before he set sail for Antarctica on his second major expedition, where he was going. His goal at that expedition was to cross Antarctica, sit down a team of men, and they're going to walk right across continental Antarctica in 1914. 1914, and and at that point their ship got crushed in the ice as they sailed down. But it's a long story, but they came back. They eventually got trying to rescue the men. 22 of the men end up staying on an island called Elephant Island, and we were able to visit that island. We couldn't set foot on it, but we were able to dock the boat very near it and go off in Zodiac boats around Elephant Island. And I mean, it really literally is a big rock. It's enormous, but it's a big rock in the middle of nowhere. And then the ship sailed down to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is a part of Antarctica that juts out closest to South America. And we went to various islands and various parts of land and islands around that vicinity. And stunning scenery. We didn't have great weather, but we had stunning scenery and amazing animals and the seals and penguins. And I'm not a big penguin fan, but it was like, they're just so much fun to watch. And as I became more of a penguin fan, but that wasn't my purpose for going. But it was like, but it is just the most unbelievable scenery. And I mean, you can't, obviously the ships aren't going now, and there's limited number of people who could go each year. It was said there are more people attend a Super Bowl game in America. So Super Bowl stadium may hold 100,000 people. Maybe each year 50,000 people go to Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
So it's very few. And so I feel very privileged to have done this. And I'm heading back in February 2022.
How exciting.
So that's so there's a lot to see, a lot to do, and yet also being very aware of the climate change is very visible. The habitats for the animals are very challenged. But we travel 3,700 nautical miles. It's stunning, absolutely stunning scenery.
I love it. I would love to go there. I don't know, about 12 or 15 years ago, someone invited me to go on it was like a scientific research boat to Antarctica, and I just couldn't fit it into my life at the time, and I've always regretted it And it's kind of on my list of things I want to do just because I love the idea of going to such a remote part of the world.
It's it's certainly remote.
Yeah.
And yeah, in 20 days, we never saw another ship. We never almost saw no humans. I mean, the only time there's only one part where that was habited. Once we left the Falkland Islands, which is inhabited, then the only time we ever saw other human beings was at one abandoned whaling station in South Georgia, which is really now set up as a museum. And that was it. It's like, it's just, and the interesting thing is you don't see a lot of plastic in the ocean. We didn't see any plastic in the ocean because the plastics that float on the surface is like 1 or 2 feet below the surface and beyond. And so you think it's like, oh, gee, it's like really horrendous because like I see all this pollution, and you don't. But you're very aware it's there. You're very aware of your own presence is impacting climate change as well. And I think we all felt very guilty about that. At the same time, for me, part of the purpose of my book and everything is to bring awareness to the great excitement of Antarctica and the value of it, and keeping people aware that the climate is going to dramatically change everything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Things are changing in the frozen parts of the world. So how do you think your own decision making has improved since you wrote this book?
I probably make as good and bad decisions as I always. I think the main thing is it's using some of the strategies. It's thinking of myself as part of teams. It's trying to focus on the present. Now, some people are very past focused. I'm very future focused. Or I don't know which you are, Holly. Hard to tell from your writing, but it's hard trying to get away from thinking about what's going to happen in the future and focus more on what's going to happen in the present.
Yeah.
Putting one foot in front of the other.
It's tough. It's a tough balance for me.
And one of the great lessons from all this is never, ever giving up. I think the phrase we use in the book is never, ever give up trying. I mean, it's not saying you need to go achieve your goal because, like we said, Shackleton turned away from his goal because he wanted to live. And I think this is the thing is keep trying. But when you can't achieve that goal, look for other ways, other things, to keep trying other things and be like, okay, I'm going to park that goal. I'm going to try something else and just keep moving forward. I'm definitely not a perfect decision maker.
Yeah, I think keep trying. That is so important. If something is really important to you, keep trying. Try something new. Try something different. I was just talking to a friend the other day and she was saying how someone had praised her because she's like on the verge of achieving this goal that she's been working towards for the last 7 years of her life. And someone said, oh, good for you for not giving up on your goals. I always give up. And it's like, can you imagine if, you'd given up a year ago, 6 months ago, 5 years ago, and not kept trying? Like, sometimes goals aren't achieved in the timeline that you want to achieve them. Sometimes it takes longer. And if it's that important, just keep trying.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the great lessons of the whole thing is they just kept persevering. And they were fluid. They worked well together. They accepted that physical hardship is part of life. That it's not always going to be easy. And I mean, we live in a time where it's psychologically challenging. Right now, it's not like I'm not sitting there worrying about where my next meal is coming from. But I worry about things like I go out, put out the recycling, and is a runner going to run by me and shedding the virus? And it's like we live in a world now that has dangers and risks, and it's accepting that does exist. And I will protect myself as much as I possibly can, but at the same time, it's a world of risk and danger, and just being psychologically strong about that.
Yeah. And so how would you recommend that people keep their spirits up when they're trying and failing, and they're on this long road towards their goal? Because I think that was one of the important things that these Antarctic explorers always managed to keep their spirits up in the most horrible conditions. So how can we do that today?
I think it's about seeking inspiration, and inspiration doesn't necessarily come from television.
Mm.
And I love television. There are lots of shows I will watch, and films. I think it comes from, quite honestly, it comes more from books, more from talking with people, more from ideas, more from songs, from poetry, from music. I think it's easy to be passive when watching television. You can sit there and it's the audio visual thing your brain can just take in. It's relaxing, having fun. And yet there's something different and engaging about audiobooks, about real books, printed books, about ebooks, about music. There's something about that causes people to think differently.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm listening to an audiobook about Leonardo da Vinci. This is absolutely wonderful. I mean, it's just the most remarkable human being probably that ever lived, ever. And it's 17 hours. And and it's yet at the same time, it's about this one guy, but it's so inspiring. And you think about all the different ways he looked at life and nature, and come away and just think that now I look at life and nature differently.
Yeah. Because
of that. But absorbing it as an audiobook is totally different than absorbing it as, I think, had it been a film, a 2 or 3 hour documentary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like in the room with you in a way film and television isn't.
And podcasts as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been listening to your podcast. It's like there's so much insights that you give, and your individual ones, the ones where you're interviewing people, the ones where you're looking at a challenge that people have. It's like, how do I deal with all the different topics you deal with that are friends, about relationships, about nature, about feeling down, about dealing with adversity, about challenges, about life in general, and just so many wonderful insights.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I also want to thank you for joining us today. I'm mindful of time. I could probably keep talking to you all day, but we all have things to do. So where can people find you online? Where can people find your book? Where can they learn more about you?
Oh, great. My website is www.extremedecisions.com. It's extreme with a dash, so extreme-decisions.com. The book is available on Amazon. It's in print and Kindle format. It's an audiobook. And I have to say, the audiobook is read by Dennis Kleiman. Dennis Kleiman he was born in South Africa. He grew up partly in England, lives in America, has this very international voice. I sought someone who might sound like the early Antarctic explorers might have sounded like. Yeah. And that's Dennis. I mean, just this rough, gravelly, deep male voice. And it's just absolutely wonderful. And if you get a chance to try the audiobook, it's only 5 hours long. And Dennis is just the most remarkable voice. And we were finalists in the Voice Arts Awards and went to Hollywood, and we're in an event with Sigourney Weaver, and we didn't win in our category, which was for nonfiction. But it was just the most thrilling event. And it was all because of Dennis's narration.
Yeah, he's spectacular.
So it's really good. And so I'd recommend check it out on Amazon, please, and reach out to me via my website, and just look forward to feedback and comments. And I'm also available on LinkedIn, and on Twitter's sign is @PolarDecisions.
Oh, I like that.
But I'm not often on Twitter, and I'm more often on LinkedIn. And
all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your insights. I think decision-making is something that the more we are aware of how we make decisions, the better decisions we'll make. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Holly. I really, really enjoyed being on your show, and it's a great honor and privilege to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. Please drop me a line and let me know what you thought of this week's episode. You can email me at holly@hollywharton.com or find me online and get in touch there. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoy this episode, please leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember to visit hollywharton.com/370 for the show notes on this episode. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to Into the Woods with Holly Wharton. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for topics that were discussed, at hollywharton.com. That's HOLLYWORTON.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and get support on your journey, I would love for you to join my private community on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. That's patreon.com/Holly Wharton. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.